The 1176 can be really confusing. What are all these versions for? Are they all doing the same thing? Well, I hope you watch the show. Like and subscribe if it helps you know which one it chose.
All right, let's finally talk about the 1176. This is one of the most iconic and ubiquitous compressors in audio recording history that I'm very familiar with. I'm sure you're very familiar with it if you're watching this channel. The 1176 was probably like the first compressor I encountered when just learning about the concept of compression. And it's an extremely easy compressor to use. And despite its simplicity, it has a lot of complex circuitry that was very interesting to get into. So for this video, we're going to start with the basics and kind of just explore where that takes us. So the 1176 was invented by Bill Putnam of UREI, which of course later became Universal Audio, and it quickly gained popularity for its very fast attack times. And these fast attack times allowed engineers to have almost total control over their transients. Despite its popularity, the 1176 still did undergo many different revisions and improvements by UREI. And so there are a lot of different versions of the 1176 out there, each of which have their own kind of flavors. However, the most popular of those revisions are probably the Rev A and the Rev D/Rev E. The Rev A and D are kind of the same, aside from maybe some cosmetic differences. And those are the versions of the 1176 that you'll see most hardware clones or software emulations based on. The 1176 uses a FET, or a field effect transistor, as its gain control device. And it's very similar to a vacuum tube in the way it conducts a signal. And it also has a lot of nonlinearities that come in the form of harmonic distortion. However, what distinguishes a FET from a tube or an optical cell is its ability to very quickly change its impedance. While tubes take time to heat up, or optical cells take time to light up, a FET can basically turn hot or cold almost instantaneously in reaction to a control voltage. This allows the 1176 to have extremely fast attack times. And by extremely fast, we're talking about 20 to 800 microseconds. Now, to put that in perspective, the average attack time of an LA2A is 10 milliseconds. So we're talking about 0.02 of 1 millisecond at its fastest, or 0.8 of 1 millisecond at its slowest. It also provides a broad range of release times from 50 milliseconds to 1.1 second. And the ability to control the attack and release times independently allows for a lot of control over your transients, making it a great compressor to use on just about any source. Now, the 1176 is an extremely simple compressor to use. Much like the LA2A, it has two primary knobs for kinda sorta controlling the threshold as well as the output. But unlike the LA2A, it also has dedicated attack and release times as well as ratio switches. And I'm using air quotes here because there is some nuance to that. And of course, on the far right, you have your metering controls, which allow you to switch from metering the gain reduction to the actual output coming out of the unit, and you can meter at +4, which is for more nominal, average level, line level signals, and +8 is for when that signal is maybe hotter than average. The input knob does exactly what you'd expect it to do. It controls the gain going into the input transformer. It also controls the amount of compression. The more gain you give it, the more compression you get. For this reason, you often hear the claim that the 1176 has a fixed threshold, but I actually think this is a bit of a misnomer, and we'll talk about that in a bit. The output knob also does exactly what you'd expect it to do. It controls the gain going into the output transformer. Now, the input and output sections, particularly the transformers, are where you're going to get most variation between the different versions of the 1176. The Blue Stripe era 1176s, which include the Rev A, are known to be much noisier and have a lot more non-linearities. And technically speaking, this is a bad thing, but they are still very popular because those non-linearities add a lot of character and vibe to the sound, especially on things like vocals, because there's a bit of a top end boost when you push either the input or output transformer. And the blackface era of the 1176, which includes the Rev D and Rev E, introduced the low noise modification, which decreased the noise floor, and also changed the transformers, giving the 1176 a more transparent and I guess stable sound. Now, despite these major differences, both eras of the 1176 are known for their iconic sound, which was admittedly kind of lost with later iterations when they swapped out the Class A discrete output section for integrated circuits. And this is why most hardware clones and software emulations are of earlier revisions, and Universal Audio themselves still manufacture and sell the Rev E. So I mentioned earlier that the term fixed threshold is a bit of a misnomer for the 1176, and I also said that there's some nuance to how the ratio controls work. And to understand what I mean by that, we need to understand how compression is actually happening on an 1176. As mentioned, the 1176 uses a FET as its main gain control device. You basically have a control circuit that drives the FET and it changes its resistance, which causes compression. And that's how every compressor works, whether it's a VCA or an optical cell or a vacuum tube. But the FET isn't actually causing compression on its own. It's actually part of what's known as a voltage divider circuit. And a voltage divider is just a circuit with two resistors in it running in series. And as the signal at a certain voltage passes through it, the gain of the incoming signal will be reduced by a specific ratio. And since the FET is one of these resistors and it's being driven by a control voltage that we derive from the incoming signal, then our actual compression ratio is program dependent. It depends on the incoming signal. So it begs the question, if we can't actually control the ratio, what do these ratio controls do? Well, they control the threshold. All of these ratio buttons correspond to a series of resistors that are impeding the flow of the signal into the sidechain. So when none of the buttons are pressed down, all of the resistors are engaged and none of the signal enters the sidechain. As soon as we press one of these buttons down, we are bypassing that corresponding resistor and letting some of the signal into the sidechain, essentially setting the threshold. Now, once this signal enters the sidechain, it gets split and sent to two different places within it. One of those places is a rectifier diode, which helps determine how aggressive the compression will be. That's why even though these switches aren't controlling the ratio, it still looks like they do, because the higher value you choose, the more aggressive your compression will be. Now, something here to note is that the higher ratio you choose, the higher the threshold will also be, so you do want to adjust your input gain accordingly. But this all might be very confusing to you, given everything we've just talked about with the ratio being program dependent. And the reason we do get compression at what looks like a fixed ratio is because of the 1176's feedback detection circuit. Essentially, the sidechain is listening to the signal after it's already been compressed by the FET. And the reason it does this is because the FET is very non-linear. So it's kind of unpredictable. We don't know how much it's going to compress exactly according to the control voltage. So we need to listen to what it's outputting and then adjust the control voltage accordingly. And that's what gives us what looks like a fairly linear compression curve. All right, now that we finally know how one works, let's take a listen to one in a mix. And before we do, I just want to mention that the multitrack for this demonstration is available through a link in the description below. Also, if you or anyone you know is in need of any kind of music-related services, such as producing, recording, mixing, mastering, I will leave a link to my SoundButter profile and my email in the description below. So let's start by talking about the drums. So I have two instances of the 1176 pulled up here. The one on top here is the Rev E, and I'm using it on my all drums bus. And this is where I like to do all my drum compression. And I like to use a fast attack and fast release. And the reason for that is that I can really emphasize the sustain of the drums as well as the kind of tone of the overheads and room mics. Now, normally my go-to for my drum bus compression is an API 2500. And as you can see, it also has a very fast attack here. This is 30 microseconds, and then I've got a fairly fast release. But one point of comparison is that I have my fast settings here for my attack and release in the clockwise position, whereas on the 2500, it's in the counterclockwise position. And this is traditionally where you would expect the fast attack and release to be, but on the 1176, it is the opposite. So just something to bear in mind. Okay, so let's just take a listen. First dry and then with compression on. Okay, so you can really hear what I mean. It really glues the whole drum sound together as you'd expect a compressor to do. But there is one issue, and that is that we are losing a lot of our output volume. So as I'm compressing this, the signal coming out is quite a bit quieter. And it can be kind of tricky to dial in your makeup gain because we're working with dynamics and we are inherently changing kind of the actual volume of signals. It's easy to kind of trick your ears into thinking something is better or worse because you are making it louder or quieter, which is why we have these metering switches over here. So right now we're looking at the gain reduction, but we can also look at the level of the output signal. And we have two options for metering that. We can use the +4, which is for, like, I would say more like standard level, like line level signals coming in. But then we have the +8 for whenever the signal is kind of hot, which is going to be the case with the drum bus. But let's just take a look at what happens when we have it on +4. And I'm going to turn my compression off. So you can see that needle just gets blasted into the red, and it's just glued to that +3. So let's move it to +8 here. So it's bouncing around quite a bit more. So, but you can see it peaking between like 2 and 3 whenever that snare hits. So let's just take a look at what happens with compression on. So you can see that it's much, much quieter. It's not just our ears, but the meter is telling us that as well. So what we can do is we can just bring this output up, and as we're listening, we'll just pay attention to what's happening over here as well. And let's just take a listen to that in the context of the mix as well. So really awesome how much difference that makes. Now, as much as I love the way that sounds, I do want to get a little bit of my transient back, and that is where parallel compression comes into play. And that's what this bottom 1176 is for. Now, this is a version of the 1176 that we haven't talked about yet. This is the anniversary edition, which did a limited run in 2008. And it essentially has like some of the components of the Rev A, but also the LN mod from like the Rev E, I guess. It's kind of like a hybrid between the two. That's my understanding of it anyway. But the main reason I'm using this version is because of this slow setting right here. So just as a reminder, our attack time range is between 20 microseconds and 800 microseconds. So even at its slowest setting on a normal 1176, the attack time is still less than a single millisecond. When I select this slow setting, it brings the attack time down to 10 milliseconds, which is perfect for this sort of compression where we want to let the transient through and compress the sustain in order to really emphasize the transient. So let's take a listen to that in solo. And then in the context of the drum mix. Yeah, so it's way more punchy. You can especially hear it in the kick drum. I feel like there's just a lot more clickiness to it. And then I forgot to mention, but I'm also using the all buttons in mode right here. Apparently, you just need these three in order for it to work. I guess I could engage that one as well. Point being, you're just blasting this as hard as you can and then you just blend it in. Okay, now we can talk about vocals. I am using a Rev E for mixing my vocals here, which is kind of contrary to what I was saying earlier about the Rev A being very popular on vocals. I actually used a Rev A for recording my vocals. So you can kind of see in the waveform that this vocal is already pretty compressed. And I kind of just picked the Rev E arbitrarily just to kind of change things up. And I'm using the quote unquote Greg Wells attack and release settings. So he just likes to use a slow attack and fast release. But another popular setting for compressing vocals with an 1176 is like the 10 and 2, or I guess in this case, like 3 and 5. And then I follow it up with an LA2A, which is a very standard practice. Kind of handle the transients of the vocal with the 1176. And then we kind of just even out the overall performance with an LA2A. I think the best way to listen to kind of vocal compression is within the context of the mix. Hopefully you'll hear kind of a little bit of like a subtle increase in presence. Okay, and then just for fun, I decided to bypass all the instances of the 1176 so we can kind of hear the difference it makes throughout an entire mix. Well, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed my take on the 1176. Leave a like if you did, subscribe, and leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Till next time, have a great day.